Welcome to the MOOC on Indian economy, policy and environment. And we have reached the last unit of this MOOC, and we are in the 12th week, and this is the last lecture that you are attending. And the title of the lecture is Indian Economy, Vision for the Future. The purpose of this lecture and the session is to give a kind of summary that we have discussed so far. At the same time, we would also like to see to the future as to what should be our focus and what should be our vision for the Indian economy in the coming years. We have discussed so far the development trajectory of Indian economy since independence, and we have traveled so far about 7, almost 8 decades of that journey, and we have discussed ups and downs, the factors behind those ups and downs, policy responses, and how those policy responses were a kind of contingent on the environment and overall economic situation, not only within India but outside. And then finally we have tried to highlight the main phases of those things, and today we are arriving at the end of this journey. We have identified 4 themes for today's discussion. We will like to summarize the key points of discussions and outline the main arguments that we have sort of pursued within this whole series of lecture. Then we will move to highlight the issues and challenges faced by the economy, both domestically as well as internationally. And then we will try to move to the underlying visible shifts occurring in the development narratives within India and also globally. And then finally, we will try to raise certain points and questions regarding the perspective for envisioning India's economic future. So these are the 4 broad themes that we will try to deal with in this session, and with this we will come to the end of this MOOC on Indian economy, policy and environment. Let me first come to the summary and arguments of this course altogether. What we have done actually, we have made an attempt at examining the development trajectory in India since independence, highlighting the various phases and features. We have broadly identified 3 distinct phases. First phase was about 1950s to 1970s, which we call summarily as a period of dirigisme, where the state-led capitalist development through planning was attempted with a reliance on public sector, that too first in the heavy industry and infrastructure, and then gradually moving towards the consumer goods sector. Then we have a phase of 70s and 80s where we have seen sort of challenges and issues coming up in pursuing that kind of development path and trying to resolve those issues and challenges by adopting certain policies as a response to those challenges, and gradual opening up was attempted. That is the phase of 70s and 80s, and during that period we have seen a certain acceleration in the growth. So that's one. And then finally we have the period of economic liberalization since 1990s, where we have tried structural reforms as well as opening up of the Indian economy and integrating it with a global economy. So these are the 3 distinct phases in India's development trajectory. In the first phase, it was heavily led by the state. In the last phase, it was heavily dependent on the market as an institution in organizing and managing the economy. And in between these two, we have a brief phase of about 10-15 years where it was a sort of negotiation between these two institutions, state and market, and therefore we have tried this path and we have seen what are the results that we have finally arrived at. Now, in the period of Dirigisme was characterized, as we have discussed adequately, by moderate growth, but with significant redistributive measures, yielding quite notable successes in establishing sort of equity and social justice. It started with land reform and ended with a variety of welfare programs with the objective of having a distributional justice. So this was a complete phase where growth was about 3% or 4%, which was criticized as the Hindu rate of growth, but nonetheless you have quite substantial success in terms of having an equitable and socially just society in India. And we have also sort of made in reference to the constitutional mandate and political imperative in establishing this. It was a requirement of a successful democracy that political equality has to be accompanied by policies of establishing social and economic inequality. Unless and until that is achieved, which was tried through the constitution in the directive principles, Article 38 and 39. So that was a kind of mandate which was given to the state, and state in a sense followed that mandate, and it has done some remarkable work into achieving the social justice and equity in the society. But the growth was quite moderate, and which was criticized as a Hindu rate of growth. Then in the 1970s and 80s, we have seen acceleration in the growth process, because the India tried to sort of bring in certain flexibilities within the system, within the control of the state, and allowing little space for private initiatives and competition. So that sort of allowed growth to accelerate. And we had during that period in 80s, the average growth rate was about 5.6% compared to the previous rate of 3.5%. So that has given a signal that this kind of flexibility, this kind of move toward liberalization can actually accelerate the growth. And it has come with several challenges. It has resulted in the kind of crisis that we had in the 1990s, which we have discussed, and then finally we have got the period of liberalization starting from 1990s, and we have seen the whole change in the paradigm, how economy is supposed to be managed. The 1990 made a paradigm shift which we call economic reform, and we have discussed these things in earlier units in detail. So I will not go into details, but just to summarize, that period of liberalization is marked by high growth rates, and it was giving a kind of rise of a middle class. It was also successful in containing the fiscal deficit, but has produced issues related to unemployment and inequality. So therefore, it was giving also a political imperative for strong nationalism. So that was a kind of situation that was the result of liberal economic policies. And then the answer to this unemployment inequality was seen as within the nations and also globally, and it has resulted and produced certain set of contradictions and crisis. So you have high growths, you have a middle class emerging, new middle class emerging, which was supposed to be producing and giving a kind of aggregate demand which is necessary to sustain the high growths during the period. Then we have also seen a containment of fiscal deficit, because that was a kind of deliberate attempt to contain the fiscal deficit, which we call fiscal consolidation. But we have inequality and unemployment, and due to this inequality and unemployment, whole question of liberalization, globalization was questioned, and whether the globalization can be sustained, globalization can be maintained, it was, or we should actually look into a new form of nationalism. That was a kind of thing, and this is a result. The strong nationalism, for political imperative for strong nationalism against the globalization, is a kind of an outcome of the contradiction and crisis that we see during the period of liberalization. The key point has been to examine in this course that connection between the economic performances and overall economic trends and environment and policy response. And then finally, we have sort of come to a conclusion that it depends basically on the type and nature of the state, the kind of policy, kind of response that you have, and the economic performances coming from those policies are contingent on the kind of state that we have. What kind of state we have, that determines the kind of policy, and in turn the policy determines the economic performances and outcome. So this is a kind of argument that we have tried to follow throughout this course, and we have therefore precisely the title this course as Indian Economy, Policy and Environment. It is the environment which determines the policy, it is the state which determines the policy, and based on those policies we have the economic performances and outcome. So essentially it is all about the what kind of state and institutions that we have, whether this is a state-led, whether it is market-oriented, market institutions, whether these institutions are liberal, whether institutions are democratic, whether these institutions are towards the people or towards the big corporates, capital. All those things are eventually the determining factors for economic outcome and economic performances. So that's the point that we have tried to pursue, and that's the point we have tried to analyze, examine, and probably you have also got a sense that after going through all the units and lectures and the materials provided, you have probably seen that this is precisely is the point which we try to follow, and which we try to sort of convince you that it is the state that matters most, the nature of the state, and that is the main point of argument of this course. Now, if we sort of summarize the economic performances during the period that we have discussed, that is starting from the independence till today, then how do you summarize the economic performances of India? Considering, of course, the different phases, the state-led capitalist resistance phase, gradual opening up and liberalization within the system, and then finally economic reform, the three phases that we have discussed. But considering that during the entire period together, that how do you summarize after going through all the units about the economic performances that we have today? So we have two things to say. We have seen that indicators like growth, poverty reduction, rate of saving and investment, infrastructure development, containment of fiscal deficit, productivity and competitiveness, all these things, the India's performances have been very impressive. It is very impressive given the fact that it has got independence in the 1940s, and compared to all those countries relative to the performances of all those countries, India's performances can be considered as quite impressive. And that is precisely probably the reason that Indian government is now have a vision, that is the government vision of Viksit Bharat at 2047. At the 100th anniversary of our independence, we envision ourselves to be one of the developed nations. I think that is the justification. This justification for this vision is that we have quite impressive performances in terms of growth, poverty reduction, increase in the rate of saving and investment, developing infrastructure, fiscal deficit, productivity, competitiveness, so on and so forth. So that's the kind of one set of indicator where we have got quite good results during this period. There is, however, another set of indicators, especially relating to those human development, such as hunger, nutrition, child mortality, maternal mortality, employment generation, inequality of income and asset. Our performances are not probably up to the mark, such as the growth or poverty reduction. So we have a kind of performance that we have. It is actually a mixed performance. In some indicators, which are basically the typical economic indicators, India's performance has been quite good. But in case of human development indicators, we have many more things to achieve. So that's the kind of dilemma, or that's the kind of trade-off that we have, which broadly can be considered as a trade-off between growth and equity. The growth you have, but in terms of equity, people-centric development, and the development of human capital, we have lot to do. So this reminds us to a title of a book by Amartya Sen and John Reyes. The title of the book is Uncertain Glory, India and its Contradiction. I think that's the contradiction that we have, that why do we have a kind of high growth but not necessarily accompanied by a kind of high levels of indicators telling us about the human development situations in the country. So where is the disjunction? Where is the disconnect that we need to understand? And probably in envisioning the future, we have to resolve this contradiction, that not only the one set of indicators are important, but equally important in the other set of indicators, we should have the increase in both the set of indicators, not only just one set. So therefore, this provides a kind of a clue as to how we should pursue and how we should envision our economic future or development future. Then we move to the second part of our discussion, that is when we try to envision our future, economic future, then we have to also take note of the contemporary issues and challenges. We are having a series of challenges and issues, and we have to take note of those issues and challenges so that in envisioning the future, we can take care of those issues and challenges. Now, economic growth, the first challenge is that this economic growth continues to be a challenge, that how long you can sustain such economic growth given by the kind of the policies that we have been pursuing. There are issues related to aggregate demand. The economic inequality is there, and aggregate demand is not increasing. And since we are not having the aggregate demand, there is a limit to the kind of economic growth. And when the growth is limited, you are also having the limitation in terms of the public revenue. And when you have public revenue limitation, again fiscal deficit, that we have got success in containing, there is a challenge that it may at any point of time can go up. Now, one's reason for this less aggregate demand, we have already discussed, that growing unemployment and stagnation of income, and it has also got the consequences for human development. You have got consequences for human development because if you have a prolonged unemployment, that will actually suppress the income. And when this income will go down, then many of the things which are required not only to increase the level of aggregate demand, but at the same time, you have to have the set of human development indicators to rise, that will be halted, and therefore this is another issue. Then of course we have the rising inequality of income and wealth. There is no point of repeating it. We have stressed enough that this period is marked by the rising inequality of income and wealth, not only domestically within the country, but also globally it is a concern. On top of this, we have the issue of climate change and the issue related to sustainability. So that's another issue, that kind of growth that we are pursuing, the kind of environmental footprints that it is creating, so therefore we have to rethink the whole growth path once again, and we have to take note of the climate change issues and sustainability. The most important point here is that all these issues are interrelated, and you cannot deal with individually. You cannot deal in bits and pieces. We need an overall approach, and that is why the nature of the state is extremely important, that how the state responds to all those issues and challenges in having an overall approach. So that's the question that we need to answer, and that's the question we need to pause ourselves. Most importantly, when we are delivering this course, we are also seeing a global trends for coming from the US-led tariff war. It is seen as a kind of reversal to the free trade. What we had in the globalization, free trade means the free movement of goods and the services, free movements of the capital, labor. So all those were part of the characteristics of globalization. Now we are having reversal of all those things. So I think that's one important point which is coming globally, and it has resulted in anti-migration policies, and it has got implications because of migration taking place from countries to countries. You are having implications for the employment, not only the employment rates and unemployment rates, but also for the income level. And when we are having that kind of policy, that suppose people are being sent back to their original countries, naturally it will actually add to the reserve army of labor, and it will further suppress the income. So therefore that's going to create huge implications for all the countries. So in a sense, we are seeing all over the world there is a trend towards reversal of globalization and rise of neo-nationalism. Every country is trying to go inward, and therefore it may result in a new changing world order. So therefore when we try to visualize the economic future for India, then we have to also take note of this changing world order, that everybody is actually trying to have their brand of nationalism, and it is in a sense sort of exposing the limits of free market, if not market failure. We have a debate regarding market failure, but now what we are saying, it's not exactly the market failure. I would like to say that there is a limit of free market institutions. So all these, the issues and challenges that we are seeing today, is exposing that limit of the free market as an institution of organizing the economic affairs. So therefore, within this context, we have an emerging narratives on degrowth and delinking. Now, degrowth means that we do not need much growth, and we do not need all the time integrated global market. There is some requirement of limiting the growth, that is degrowth, and also delinking, that not necessarily that everything is integrated in the global economy. There should be some amount of delinking that is also required. And this literature is growing up fast. That literature is coming. People like Jason Hickel, for instance, he has written a book like Less is More, sort of trying to suggest that if you are having less growth, it is good, more good for the world and more good for the countries. So therefore, we are having a degrowth and delinking narratives coming up. Within this broad context, that there are certain things which are happening within country, and there are certain things within country we are having a contradiction in the form of that economic indicators are moving fast, accelerating, human development indicators are not catching up. So that's a contradiction within the country. And there are some overlapping issues like employment creation, inequality, the limit of growth that is coming up, not expanding economic activities enough. So those things are there. And globally, we are seeing a rise of a new kind of world order. So within this context, we have to envision a vision for India. And this vision, obviously, we cannot suggest. It has to come through a democratic dialogue, democratic process. But I would like to suggest to the viewers that what are the learnings from the past and what could be the components of those vision for India. We cannot, of course, dispense with economic growth altogether, but you need not always target high growth. Moderate growth rate to 6 to 8% should be sufficient, but we have to go for the distributional aspect of those growth process. So we have to go for human development aspects. How to achieve the growth? You have to balance the demand and supply. Only demand side like Keynes or only supply side may not work. And we have seen the limitation of both focusing only on the demand side and both focusing, and then also focusing only on the supply side. We have seen the limitations of the both. Most important is the process of growth, making it more inclusive, both in the broad-based sense and also pro-poor sense. Climate change is a reality, but this climate change should also highlight the sustainability from the triple bottom line approach, that is social, economic and environmental. All three spheres should be sustainable. Inequality that we have economically is not sustainable. Social hierarchies that we have is not sustainable. Environmental climate change impacts not sustainable. So we need not necessarily only concentrate only on one, but we have to take all three. The whole question is all about what kind of state and what kind of institutions we should have. We have seen the kind of state in the 50s and 60s. We have seen the kind of state in the 90s onwards. We have seen the kind of institutions like planning commission in the 50s, 60s, 70s and its limitations. We are seeing the new kind of institution emerging. So we have to think about the kind of state and kind of institutions in envisioning those future for the India. Now, it's not going to be a kind of old welfare state. It is probably going to be a new welfare state where proactive policies towards redistributive justice will be a hallmark of that new welfare state, which will try to address the income and non-income inequalities. And politically, that new welfare state should focus on substantive democracy rather than procedural democracy. So that's the kind of state probably that we will have, and then only we have a future. And institutions should have incentives, positives and negatives, the series of incentives for positive and series of incentive for negative. If it is adversely harming the income distribution, then we must have institutions providing disincentives. But if it is actually helping and facilitating income distribution, we must have incentives for such kind of activities. So institutions are to provide the right kind of incentives, and then only this kind of future can be envisioned. Finally, the Indian economy has both challenges and prospects, but it is contingent on overall economic condition and environment, which is changing, fast changing. The future lies therefore in anticipating these conditions and environment and understanding them properly, and then responding with appropriate policies. And that response can come only when you have a kind of new welfare state and the right kind of institutions providing right kind of incentives. Now the question is that should we push the existing economic reforms further, as if these problems are arising because the reforms are not enough and we have to have more reform? Should we push that argument, or should we rethink the present set of reforms itself? So therefore, this is the question we need to ask, whether the existing reform is good enough and we need to push them further, or whether we need to have a set of reforms altogether different from the existing ones. And I believe, and this is my kind of take, that distributive sensitive reform rather than only growth sensitive reform, which we have presently, is a need of the hour. Then only we can have an economic future for the country. So therefore, with this argument that present set of reform is growth sensitive rather than distribution sensitive, we need to have a different set of reform which is not only growth sensitive but distribution sensitive. That kind of reform we will need, and then only we can have a bright and good economic future for the country. With this, we have come to the end of our MOOC. Hope you have enjoyed the MOOC and you have learned something, and you have the recipe to think yourself that what is good for India and what is good for its people. Thank you very much.